Hello everyone, welcome to part 2 of EDBED 2008 and EDFGC 2020, week 10. So in this part of the recording I'll be looking at English as an additional language or dialect, which is all part of this week's theme on diversity. The learning intention for this part is a similar thing, but obviously in respect to ELD. So develop your understanding of how to incorporate effective strategies and develop resources, and also understand your understanding of effective teaching and learning strategies when you're working with students whom English is not their first language. And you should be able to identify some relevant cultural considerations in your planning and connect appropriate teaching strategies to your aim and the student's needs, and also view some illustrations of practice and relate strategies to cater for ELD learners in respect to your own programming. Two acronyms are quite important. In these slides you see ELD a lot, which is English as an additional language or dialect, and that's also words that you see a lot in policy and curriculum programs, etc. In your reading that I sent through as an email attachment, you also see TESOL, which talks about teachers of English to speakers of other languages. So I just thought I'd clarify what those acronyms are. If we look then at what the Australian curriculum says in respect to ELD, you can see that that's got quite a prominent place in the Australian curriculum. Obviously, this is again part of the Melbourne Declaration for Young Australians, that we need to cater for diverse learners, making sure that everyone gets an equitable and meaningful education. So therefore, there are a number of resources and considerations in place to make sure that this actually happens. So I've just put a little photo, a snapshot there of the page from Akara, but if you click on the slides here, you get the hyperlink and you can get into some of these documents, and I've taken chunks and pieces that I think might be relevant for you as well. To begin with though, let's have a look at the Victorian curriculum, which informs us that many students in Australian schools, surprise, surprise, are learners of English as an additional language, which means that they have another first language which is not English, or standard Australian English, and therefore they need additional support to help them develop English language proficiency. A lot of ELD learners do really well in school, but there are also a big significant group, or a big chunk of them, who are not actually achieving their full potential, which is why we need to make sure that we cater for these students as teachers. ELD learners come from really diverse backgrounds. It can be children whose first language, again, is a language other than English. In this group is also Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students whose first language is an Indigenous language, or Creoles, or a dialect, Aboriginal English as well. EL learners enter school at different ages and different stages of English language learning, which means that they both come with various backgrounds that we need to take into consideration. Also, it might mean that they actually working at a different proficiency level compared to their peers. So their maturity might be at one level, but the type of English that they comprehend and can express is at a different level. In respect to what the curriculum aims are, English is ultimately the same for all students. However, EL learners or ELD learners are simultaneously learning a new language and the knowledge, understanding of skills of the English curriculum. So therefore, they need support. And it also means that we as teachers need to explicitly address their language needs. We need to think about that when we're planning to help our students. There are a number of different documents that are there to assist us. For example, there's a National EL EAL document that's produced to support the F-10 curriculum, and we're going to have a look at some snippets of support documents like that. You've also got some advice on how to plan for your learners through that link. So I thought it's quite helpful to actually not just hear me talk, but to have some resources. And I've got 2 illustrations of practice here that I'd like you to view. And in regard to that, there are also some resources to connect with. So the first one, click on the hyperlink on these slides and you'll get to it. I've put up the slides on Moodle. They're only short clips, so they don't go for very long. This is a teacher's working in a secondary setting, but nevertheless the ideas are still relevant. First, there's a session or a snippet, if you like, where this ELD teacher is conferring, having a conference with another mainstream teacher. And my computer is playing up today. And we see some of the planning considerations that she's suggesting he needs to take into consideration when he's talking about a sequence of learning for his students. There's also a resource, which you can see linked there, which has got, again, some planning documents or some planning considerations that you might want to draw on, and they're referring to it in the video clip. You also have an illustration of practice, which is connecting to reading strategies from memory. And you've also got some documents there. So have a look-see, that's your online component this week, to have an examination of how that all fits in. So I'm assuming in fact, I'd suggest that you pause this, view those clips, and then come back to it. ELD students may have really good academic language skills, but they will struggle sometimes with English and the kind of cultural connections, the social registers of English, how we speak, and the inferred meanings sometimes. Generally, ELD learners are placed in Australian schools at the year level appropriate for their age. So their cognitive development, i.e. their thinking and their understanding and their life experiences, might not at all correlate with their proficiency in English. They might require quite high levels of support, emotionally, culturally, as their social and cultural expectations are quite varied. Again, I mean, if you have a student who's perhaps only just arrived in Australia, they may be a refugee, they may be a migrant, it all depends on where they're coming from. And obviously you want to get to know your students, and in order to be able to take your students into consideration when you plan. So there can be quite complex backgrounds to these students at times. These students may be unfamiliar with what we see as mainstream accepted classroom routines, again, because it's a cultural aspect. We come from different dimensions, and organisational aspects of learning, deadline dates, divisions of time. They might be quite foreign concepts to some of these students. They certainly benefit greatly from support, and if possible bilingual support. So if we can tap into either students who speak the same language, or parents, or if we have access to some sort of interpreter service, we want to connect with that, because that's a way of supporting these students in developing their English language skills by actually connecting to the language that they have. Often these students take more time than other students to understand the concepts and the language required in the classroom, which is obviously a planning consideration again. They might be quite unfamiliar with the purposes for reading and writing and rely really heavily on visual cues for instruction, etc., to help them. They may well be quite unfamiliar with some digital technologies and particular subject-specific equipment that we often use in Australian classrooms. So again, it's a matter of not assuming that the students have the sort of knowledge that we think mainstream students have. There's quite a good document. If you click on this link, I've just taken a little snippet of content descriptions, which is from the Australian curriculum, but obviously that is what underpins the Victorian curriculum as well. I think I took this from a year 2 level. So it's illustrating some content descriptions that we would see in the curriculum, and then some of the language cultural considerations for us and some teaching strategies. So I have just put up these two as an example. I encourage you to actually go and look at that document. It's not very long, but it's quite helpful. So if we're looking at texts and contexts, and in this example discussing different texts on a similar topic, identifying similarities and differences between the texts, which is quite possibly something you might use in your sequence. A cultural consideration there is that we all cultures have different literary traditions, whether they be spoken or written or both. And those traditions can be drawn upon when we're identifying texts to examine in the classroom. So we might actually get our students, our ELD students, to share their favourite stories from their own lives, and family members or bilingual assistants, interpreters can be quite helpful in sharing these stories. If we're looking at interacting with others, listening for specific purposes and information, including following instructions and extending students' own and others' ideas. Listening is obviously, or not surprisingly, quite difficult for students who don't really have the language skills. So they might phase out, they might lack attention, and that could be an indication that there's just information overload. So we might have some silent periods for them, and provide the listening components in snippets. We support, and this is really important, to support verbal instructions with visual supports and gestures. And we obviously reconnect, we revisit the ELD learner often while on task to just reinforce those instructions so that we don't assume that they understand. And that isn't just understanding what is being said, it's also the prior understandings and the concepts that can be quite complex that we're talking about, to tap into the students actually having that prior understanding again. We might use groups as well, we might use one-on-one, but we need to keep on track, because just because a student is sitting there quietly obviously doesn't mean that they understand, so we need to keep that in mind. But as I said, I'm just going to flick back. This document that's hyperlinked there has actually got a number of good things to keep in mind, which I think is helpful. Again, you've got a hyperlink here of ELD teaching strategies, which has got a lot of different strategies specifically aimed at literacy, and they're focused into speaking and listening, reading and writing, with a number of specific strategies that you may include as part of your sequence as well. And where this fits in, again, is in that part B, where you're including some cross-curricular and ELD connections. That's where this fits in. So you're putting in a little indication of how this sequence actually connects with strategies that support ELD learners, or that is connected with a cross-curricular priority, as I said in the previous lecture. Those of you who were in the workshop last week, we looked at this sequence. This is a template that's up on Moodle, and I would suggest that it's actually probably quite helpful for you to do your sequence using that sort of table. So if you're looking at the 5A phase, the engage, explore, etc., etc., you put in your indicators from the curriculum, which is obviously depending on what your class is and the curriculum areas. Oh, things are flying off my wall. Then you're looking at what the learning experience includes, what you actually want the student to come away with, what resources you're going to use. And here in the other section is your grouping consideration. So it might be whole class to small stations, or in pairs or whatever. You can also here indicate cross-curricular connection and ELDs. It's a way for you to flag whatever it is that you're doing in the learning experience, how that connects with these different considerations. I'm getting a few emails from people who have not attended the tutorials as regularly as they should have. So I'm actually going to record a mini lecture where I just go through the rubric for the second assignment too. My assumption has been that you will get to the tutorial and get the information there, but just as a backup, also because I'm going to be away this week, I'll do that, so that should hopefully clarify it. All right, thank you very much.